Hello everybody. So how do we decide to create a new Symfony component? That's the question. I hope I'll have time at the end of the talk to answer your question. So let me start with the presentation first. So quick introduction to Symfony to define what we are talking about. So Symfony has been open sourced. Symfony 2 has been open sourced almost 10 years ago, a bit more. It's open source, you know that already, of course. It's built for the web in PHP, so that's the domain, the business domain of Symfony. It's quite wide. It's the collection of the most used PHP components. If you go on Packages, you'll see that Symfony packages are the most downloaded ones by Composer. So I think you know all that already. Symfony as a project has about 4,000 unique contributors along the years. So that's a lot. That's quite active. That's about 500 unique contributors per year, which is great. We're super happy that you all contribute to Symfony doing typos or big features. It's 40 billion cumulative downloads, so all components, all versions. If we add up this number, it's quite big. It doesn't mean anything except maybe to compare how things are downloaded versus the other component in the ecosystem, and also to see the pace of adoption. And this number is growing fast. Like the first billion was not far ago, and so we cross and we accelerate on this number, which is good. It means we have a healthy ecosystem, and Symfony is being more and more adopted to build applications. Symfony is one project, and in this project we have a structure of components. So we have about 60 core components. By 60 core components, I mean things that we manage in one Git repository. So we have a mono repository. So that's 60 components, and we have more components than the core one. We have 200 components. Their account bridges, also like bridges for mailer, for notifier, for messenger. We have a bunch of them. We also account Twig there, account Mercure, which is not in the central repository, but that's still part of the Symfony project and open source ecosystem that we manage together. So that was the presentation. So those components have been contributed along the year, and Symfony 2 started in 2011 with the core component. You know, Symfony is built for web apps, so of course it started with the Symfony components that you all know about, like HTTP Foundation, of course, HTTP kernel, the YAML, the form, process, routing, etc. So I was not born in the Symfony ecosystem at the time. I entered Symfony after this slide. So this is the work of Fabian, William, Bernard, and many, many others that came from Symfony 1 and decided to rewrite everything using decoupling as much as possible. So I don't need to justify those components. The project needed to start with something, and that's basically the thing that started. And then, okay, that's where I entered the ecosystem. And my first significant contribution to Symfony has been the var dumper component. During this time, Fabian contributed the asset component. I'm not going to go through each component one by one, but they all have a story I could tell you about. They all have a story of why they came up and why they are Symfony components now. So I can tell you about this component I contributed, the var dumper one. You know the dump function, right? Who doesn't know the dump function? Okay. And so this is a work that I created before entering Symfony in my own framework, because that was the time where everybody had their own framework, right? And so I had a component to dump things. And when I joined Sensio Labs, I showed that to Fabian and a few others, and they told me, oh, let's try to put that in Symfony. That's how var dumper came. At the time, there was also something called Ladybug, and Ladybug is abandoned now because var dumper is so much better. So we basically compete at the beginning, and in the end, var dumper is so much better that now the guy maintaining Ladybug said, I don't have time for that anymore, which is nice. He can do something else. And we replaced that with something that apparently the community loves. So that's also LDAP property info. This is from Kevin. The polyfills. Polyfills are not part of the core, but they are part of this project we maintain. I contributed the first polyfills also because I wrote polyfills before in my own framework. And so with the help from Fabian, I rewrote everything to make it fit the Symfony quality standards. And this is when the polyfill were born. I wrote the cache component. So the cache component has been released because, the PHP Fig was working on the PSR6, the cache interfaces. And so we knew that we wanted a cache component in Symfony because caching is critical to web apps, right? And we knew also that the Fig was working on something, and we did not want to create a component that was not compatible with the work happening at the Fig. So when the Fig released PSR6, we decided to start working on the component, and this is the cache component. Of course, there have been other caching systems like Stash, Doctrine Cache, and there are many others that were used at the time and were also quite significantly used. I think those are mostly abandoned now. So Doctrine Cache is deprecated. Stash, I think it's not much used, at least in the project I see around. And that's for the better because, for example, in the cache component, it started as something simple. And because Symfony is so widely used, there are people that come with quite advanced use cases. And this is unique to Symfony. Like on the Redis adapters, I know that people contributed the tag systems. So there you can cache and invalidate using tags. And this is much more advanced than what we contributed at the beginning of the component. That's because someone figured out that need to push this further. So this is a great component because of the community. And thanks to the community. Then we continued. So .env, which is a component that Fabian needed for the Flex experience. You know that Symfony apps are configured using environment variables. At the time, if I looked at the pull request that introduced all components, that's why I have a story for each of them. At the time, there were, and there still are, other .env components. And so, for example, Laravel is using the one I put on the screen, which is vlucas php.env. Fabian looked at this one to say, oh, maybe we can build Flex on that. And actually, he figured out that no, because this was too heavy. This php.env component is too heavy because it has too many features. Like it supports filters, and we did not want something that was so much advanced. We wanted something that was very, very narrow to boot minimal applications. And so that's where Fabian realized that he had no choice but create a new component to also have full control over the starter skeleton experience. So which others? So Messenger, var exporter, Mercure, the mailer component. So the mailer component is Swift Mailer version 5. So Swift Mailer version 5, that's because Swift Mailer is now abandoned. So you may know that Swift Mailer was not created by Fabian, but Fabian took over maintenance in the last 10 years because the project maintainer at the time decided to move to something else. And so he decided to, Fabian proposed himself as a maintainer of that. And Swift Mailer is something that Fabian and I figured out or thought that it's difficult to maintain. If you look at the inside of Swift Mailer, there is a queue system there because when you send a mail, you want to put that on a queue so that it can be sent asynchronously, right? You also want an HTTP client because you need to send your email through HTTP calls and not just SMTP calls, right? So you have many services to coordinate. So you want a dependency injection container, right? So Swift Mailer had everything inside. If you open the code of Swift Mailer, you see that there is a DI framework, there is a pull system, there is HTTP clients, there are adapters. Basically, there is a framework in Swift Mailer. The issue is that this framework has been designed 15 years ago, and we know now that we can do much better. And so instead of rewriting Swift Mailer and naming it version 5, we decided that, hey, we already have a messenger component. We already have many things like the MIME component that we can leverage to build a simple mailer component that will borrow features from the other components. And that's how we decided to abandon Swift Mailer and create a simple component mailer that would just leverage the other components to fix, and to implement DI, queuing, etc. So you understand now why the mailer component has been created instead of maintaining Swift Mailer, to make things much simpler and decoupled and flexible in the end. So HTTP client is also a component that has been created because of Mailer, because I told you Swift Mailer or sending an email needs an HTTP client. At the time we said, okay, since we need an HTTP client, we need an HTTP client component. The reason is that there is Guzzle, but Guzzle is too heavy for the need. And also we have this experience with Guzzle that its API is a bit outdated. So we wanted to have something that we had full control over so we could iterate and decouple and also improve, making the experience better. So that's HTTP client. And then in the last years, we created more components, runtime, UID, HTML sanitizer, and the last one is the clock component. I can't, again, spend more time on each of them. If you have specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them at the end. So I'm going to talk about a few of them. So this is an excerpt of the comments on the pull requests when we created HTTP client. So this is a comment. The first one is saying Guzzle is a standard. Symfony doesn't control the release processes, so Symfony cannot guarantee the quality of the package. And someone said, but you could not require an HTTP client in Mailer because you could just code against the abstractions. Like you code against an abstract PSR18 HTTP client, right? And then people could use whatever client they would like to. But this wouldn't fix the fact that we want Mailer to work out of the box. We want you to install Mailer and have it work, which means we need to ship an implementation right into the bundle, into the package. So that's why we wanted to create the HTTP client component, and Guzzle was not a fit. So this is another comment from Ryan saying that playing with this new code, he says the experience is wonderful, and that was a target. The experience is about how do you make async HTTP calls, how do you make 1,000 concurrent HTTP calls. With the API of HTTP client, it's super simple. You can do it. You can leverage HTTP2. And so basically, we improved the state of the art of HTTP client in PHP. So today, Guzzle is still widely used. So we did not replace anything. And HTTP client supports a nice API, PSR18, so the abstraction from the fig. Also HTTP plug, which is another abstraction that predates PSR18, and it also supports promises, which is another way to do async HTTP request in case this is your preferred way, which is the Guzzle style of doing async. So it supports all of them, and so we have, now you can decide, you have two serious proposals so that you can compare and choose the one that fits best. And I think having the choice in the technology is always is very important, right? So another one, this is the UID component. This one started and created a small drama because there is Ramsey UID, which predates the UID component. And so someone is in there saying, okay, maybe the UID is a bit simpler, but it's not like Ramsey UID is super complex. I don't agree with this statement. So that's a comment on the pull request. Ramsey UID is over-engineered. There are too many internal abstractions. You can change the way math computation are done inside the component. You can change the way random numbers are generated inside the component. And that is useful if you have a need to change the math computation implementation or the random number implementation. Do you have a need for that? Personally, I don't. So with Symfony UID, we wanted to take a very simplistic approach, trying to provide just the minimum amount of code to make this work and to ship that to everybody that wanted to adopt this simplistic approach. If you want to use Ramsey UID because you do have more advanced needs, it's still there. So there is also this discussion about, okay, this one is Symfony is pushing, I wish to see Symfony pushing for a healthy and diverse, welcoming ecosystem and community, embracing cooperation. I do too. Not leverage its popularity to appropriate stuff that might deem interesting with no regards to others. This makes me uncomfortable. I mean, why? What does this suggest? It suggests that because Symfony is Symfony, when it does something, it annihilates, it negates the existence of the other projects. I think people fear that, but they shouldn't. They shouldn't really. Symfony is just a place where people can contribute code, and if people decide to use it, fine. And if they decide to use Ramsey UID, fine also. Having the choice is always better. And so today, Ramsey UID is still widely used. UID added support for ULEADs, which is a very nice way to deal with unique identifiers, which is not a standardized one, but is standard enough to be useful. It has support for the newest versions of the RFC, so UID version 678. It has a tight integration with the Symfony ecosystem, so it means service factories, auto wiring, and everything out of the box. And the thing that is very new is that Ramsey has created a new package which is called Ramsey Identifier. He created that 1 month ago, I think, because he realized that he wanted to do version 4 of his UID library because, I didn't talk to him about that, but I think because he saw that Symfony UID had some nice proposal in there. So he said, I do also want to provide ULEADs, but that doesn't fit in the UUID component. So basically what I want to say here is that by providing competition to the only serious UID implementation, we disturbed the project and we made it move forward. We forced it to innovate, and that is good. In the end, everything is going to progress and move forward with innovation, simplifications, and things like that. And that's because there are contenders, there are people that think differently and that can compare that work and borrow the good ideas and decide to not follow what they think are not so good ideas. And so now we can have a discussion about that and not only be forced to follow the single one possible implementation. So that's about UIDs. So the last one, and then I'm going to continue, is the clock component. So this is on Twitter. Twitter is quite nice to have tweet storms, right? So drama, popcorn, things like that. So this is Matthias Novak. He talks about framework imperialism, saying, okay, Symfony takes a topic, Symfony or Laravel actually on this one, and create a component and pretend that they solve the problem. Right? That's the idea of the tweet. I think this is missing the fact that Symfony is open source, Laravel is open source, everything in our world ecosystem is open source, which means there are no boundaries. There are no empire. There is a thing, a project, where you can send code, send pull requests, and improve the state of the art. And this is very, very open. So I don't agree with this framework imperialism statement because it creates a false idea that there is a boundary with an inside the empire and outside the empire. And this is not true. The boundary is very inexistent. You can just jump inside this virtual boundary and contribute, right? So it's very easy. So that does not fit my way of seeing open source. So now another tweet on the same topic a few days after, Frank, who says, seeing Symfony create a clock component makes him sad. Okay, not suffering from not invented here, like we need control of the code, which is true. And so Symfony will push them out of popularity. Maybe not. Like I mentioned before, when there is Ramsey UID, Symfony Ramsey UID did not disappear at all. And I would say something else on this slide. It's that Frank is also a contributor to the PHP League, so the League namespace. And if you look at the League namespace, there is a MIME component in the League namespace. There is a container component in the League namespace. So basically, there are many components in the League namespace that are clones or cover the same domain as Symfony components. And they were created after the corresponding Symfony components. So basically, he's blaming Symfony for things that Frank is doing on his side. And I did not talk about Frank, with Frank about that. So I'm not shaming him at all. And I'm not shaming him because this is super fine. I'm really happy that there are other approaches to containers, other approaches to MIME decoding. I'm really happy about that. And I would also say that there are differences. So the League container, the League MIME component is different than the container of Symfony. And people, quite often in these discussions, they do not care about the technical differences. They just see things from very far, and they say, oh, this is similar. OK, let's make a shortcut. This is the same, so they are duplicating things. This is completely wrong. This is missing the details, right? And the details matter in our domain. Yes? So then there is this tweet from Taylor, which is saying something that is very true. He's saying, OK, let me give a try. Symfony created a clock component because it's trivial. It is super trivial. Because they don't want to have to bug an outside rondo with a day job and 1,000 other concerns to update PHP version, fix bugs, anything really. And that is true. When Symfony adopts a component that is not a Symfony component, it creates a lot of pressure on the maintainer of the component. We do that a few times. So there is an strict email validator in Symfony Validator, and for that we use a third-party package. And this is a big burden on this person. There's one person, he's super kind, and in the last 10 years, he's been always happy to maintain this. That's a burden on him. That's a duty on his shoulders, and we don't create that as a project without thinking twice because it is difficult to be an open source maintainer. So that's a good reason also to not do Symfony components. And the other reason is that we have very strict and very rigorous principles to maintain the code. So I'm going to go fast on this slide. I think you know most of them, but let me give you some things that we do and that are hard to ensure when we don't have control over the releasing processes or the code itself. So first, we have a predicting releasing policy. We release every 6 months for new features, every month for bug fixes. This is something that is very important. It allows companies to predict their updates. We have a mono repository, which allows us to modernize the full code base in one pull request. And we use that a lot. We have this backward compatibility promise that allows upgrading to minor version without any issue. That's also a burden. We have this forward compatibility promise, which is that maintained old version of Symfony will still work on the newest version of PHP. So if you have a Symfony 4.4 application, you can run it on PHP 8.1, and that is because of this policy that we have. Many projects in the open source world do not have this policy. There is also this deprecation policy to announce ahead of time what the next major is going to change. We have a core team, we have a security policy, we have welcoming spaces. That's also something that is difficult to achieve. Being welcoming is not always given. Like, I had to learn what it means to be welcoming, and we have to all collectively remind everybody in the community to be kind to the other people on GitHub, on Slack, everywhere. So when there is an issue, we also have a structure for that because we have a care team that is here to ensure that the code of conduct has a response when there is an issue, when people behave not correctly according to the code of conduct. And we have friendly continuous integration, which means that when you submit a pull request to Symfony, we are not going to make you work twice or more just because of CI failures about things that are like annoying code styles or things like that. We are going to make it super easy as possible to contribute to Symfony. So this is difficult to enforce if we don't have control over the code, and that's the point of this slide. It's not a sales speech, right? It is to tell you that, and doing that is a lot of work, and having control over the code allows us to do it. So this is an example of the things we do on the mono repository. I told you one big repository with all components in there allows us to do this kind of changes. So this is when we prepared Symfony 6, we decided to add return types to replace annotations by return types. And we did that in one pull request on the code base. Imagine if we had 50 third-party dependencies. That would be just impossible to manage. Completely impossible. Okay, so now let's take a bit more, let's go see things from a bit far, a higher level. So there is something, you know about the solid principles, right? They are about the way we design the classes in our software. There is also something called the package principles. There are 6 of them, and I want to focus on the subset that is called the principles of package coupling. So one says that packages should have acyclic dependencies. So package A, which depends on package B, then package B should not depend on package A, right? So this is pretty basic. That's not always the case. If you look at, I know that doctrine has doctrine persistence depends on doctrine common, which depends on doctrine persistence, which depends on doctrine common, which depends on etc. Okay? They know about that and they are fixing that. So this is about not doing that and ensuring to not do that. Stable dependencies, this principle is about being able to update the dependency when you build another package on top of it. So I mentioned this validator for HTML, for mail parsing, right, in the validator component I told you about. And we are fine with this dependency because when we send a pull request to them, they merge it quite fast. And then they do a release quite fast. So it means we are able to make this dependency stable, and we are able to make it at least as stable as the validator component. So this is the stable dependency principle. And the stable abstraction principle is about building, says that if you want to build a stable component, you need to build it on top of at least as stable components. You cannot build a stable component on top of a non-stable component. That's a bit obvious, but that's something that we can enforce if we have control over the code and we cannot otherwise. So this is the list of vendors in Symfony, and we did not create a Symfony component for all of them or for any of them. We are really fine that they are here because they contribute very useful components to the PHP world. So PHP stand, of course, but I mentioned the league namespace. So there is Guzzle in the dependencies of Symfony. So all those vendors have proven quite reliable, and we are using them for this reason. There is a set of transitive vendors that are needed by those vendors. So Symfony relies on those, and those might rely on that. This might be an issue. From my point of view, I would be more than happy to... I don't have enough confidence in them. They are too far away in terms of transitiveness from Symfony, and there is a risk for Symfony in there. It doesn't mean they are bad, it means there is less control over them, right? We did not decide to adopt them. Someone else decided for us, and there's something that from this talk could be useful that we could do in Symfony. It would be to whitelist the vendors that we have today, and when a new one pops up, we should have a CI failure so that we can review that. And maybe you could do that also in your project, reviewing the vendors and whitelisting them so that you're sure that you trust them. So let's answer a few questions, and then I'll be done with this. So how the core team decide that a given topic would make a good component? To decouple from an existing one. That's something we did in the past. We created the MIME component out of a sub namespace in HTTP Foundation. Because it covers a common need in the community, that's quite obvious. And because there are spontaneous contributions to Symfony, and we just review all contributions, and when makes sense, and when the code is fine, we are okay to merge that. Easy. Why create new components when an existing lib covers a topic? To deliver to the project's principles and values. I mentioned that, right? The previous slide. To be free to innovate, right? On the UID components, changing the architecture on Ramsey UID was not possible, of course. So now we were free to have a different proposal, to make a different proposal to the world. And I mentioned that also to take responsibility of the impact, not creating a too high burden on people on the web. How does Symfony get inspired by other projects? Does it happen often? Yes, we are inspired by other projects to identify what a common need is. It is difficult to spot what is a common need, right? So when we see that there are many people that want a messenger component, then it's maybe time for people to contribute a messenger component to Symfony. To spot not working approaches, so working and not working approaches. So it's quite often that when there is a component, a topic, I say, okay, let's say for the clock component, for example, I wanted to create this component, and I had a look at the existing implementation, and it's good to see how they do things, to see what I want to get inspired, to take inspiration from, and what I want to not do, because I don't agree with this design. So this is a good way to have inspiration. And of course, having a conversation on Twitter, on GitHub, means that ideas circulate always, all around. There is a constant discussion in the air, and the brain is sensitive to that. Our brain, so collectively, we talk together and we create new ideas. So there is a kind of convergent evolution in all ecosystems. So does the fact that Symfony components are used everywhere bring additional features? Yes. I mentioned that for the cache component. And this is a good reason to have a Symfony cache component. Because we have Symfony cache, or because we have cache in Symfony, then we can have a super powerful cache component because people contribute super advanced feature into it. And that's mind-blowing. Like when some random person comes to the repository and sends a pull request saying, I have this problem, it's quite advanced, and I have this code to fix the problem. I'm like, wow, thank you, right? So that's why alternatives can barely compete with Symfony. No problem. Visibility, impact, this is the place to contribute impactful code. And this is my last slide, I think. So this is some sentence to close the speech and to give you something to think about. It's about choosing your dependencies. Do it carefully, because at some point your dependencies are going to be your technical debt. You are going to have to run composer update, and you'll be blocked because a dependency will not be compatible with, I don't know, PHP 8 or Symfony 4 or Symfony 5 or Symfony 6. And of course, this is super complex because there is a matrix of possibilities. So choose your dependencies carefully. They will bring instability if you don't, and they will bring rigidity also if you don't, so you won't upgrade easily enough. So of course, by choosing a Symfony component, you will have stability and flexibility because of the processes we have. So people often come to us and ask, okay, there are 300,000 packages on Packagist. Which one should I choose? I don't know. At least they know that Symfony components are reliable. So by making a new Symfony component, that's one more on their list. There are a few others. I mentioned the vendors that we use. They are super fine. There are much more, of course. But it's a very difficult question. I cannot curate, and we cannot collectively curate the list of all packages on Packagist. Thank you for this talk. And I also want to thank you, all people that contribute to Symfony and that support Symfony. So I mentioned in this talk the drama, the discussions that people have on Twitter. Sometimes it's difficult, it's emotional, it's controversial, etc. You know about that. But that's not the only part that we have in the repository. We also have, feedbacks on the pull request. And I took a screenshot of all the reactions on all the components that were introduced. And those are the reactions. So there are not only negative feedbacks about that. There's a lot of positive feedback. So thank you, everybody, for that. And I hope you will continue to support and contribute to Symfony in the coming years. Thank you very much, and see you at the next SymfonyCon in 2 weeks or at the next Symfony conference later on. Thank you again.
Are there any questions to Nicolas? Probably you can ask more questions than only about the speech. Anyone? Oh, okay.
Do you ever see bringing ORM under the Symfony roof?
Do we have what?
ORM instead of using the doctrine dependency?
No, we are fine with doctrine. I mean, doctrine is a difficult dependency because they have their own releasing policies, they have their own way of doing deprecations, major upgrades, and we learned to work with them. But we only have one life, and creating an ORM would require a second one, so.
I hope that answers the question. Is there any other question?
Do you plan on investing more time into Docker and stuff related to that topic?
So Symfony in Docker, you mean?
Yes.
It works already, no?
Yes, it does, but I'm asking about recipes, like investing more than it's currently having, like a recommended way of working with Docker and all that.
Okay, I'm not sure, because we focus on the PHP side of things and the way things then are packaged or made, bundled into Docker images and things like that, is not in the core team, so it's not in the target that we have in mind. I know that Kevin is working on Docker images or things like that, so you should definitely have a look at the work that is happening there, and I think those are really great. So the work is done, basically, for what needs to be done, and there can be also always improvements, but we don't have a specific idea about Docker in Symfony. We care about the PHP side of things.